Welcome back, guys. Today's episode is, well, it's pretty special. It's special in a couple of ways. Number one, if you're listening to this on iTunes or Spotify, know that I've also released the video version of this podcast on YouTube. And the reason for that is because my guest today just brought incredible slides to share with people. And I thought it would be more interesting for you to be able to see the slides while he's speaking to them, rather than me putting up the slides in the show notes somehow, and then you trying to go back and listen to it and put the slides together with the show notes. So number one, it's on video and it's on YouTube. So I invite you to check out the YouTube version if you haven't done so. And it's just on my channel, which is Nathalie Niddam. All of my audio, all my other podcasts are there too. And in addition, I've got a lot of older podcasts that I used to only do video for there as well. So it might be a new world for you guys to discover. Number two, this is a long episode. It's an hour and a half. So pace yourself, give yourself some time, maybe split it up. I don't know. I don't usually do podcasts this long, but in this case, I think it was warranted. Also, even with an hour and a half podcast, we didn't actually get through everything. So there will be a part 2 to this podcast coming down the pipes in the next 2 to 3 weeks or so. We've already got it scheduled. Hopefully it holds. Anyway, you're probably wondering, who the heck is she talking about and why am I listening to this? My guest today is Dr. Bill Laurence. Dr. Bill Laurence is a researcher. He's got a PhD in nutrition. He is very, very interested in longevity, in extending lifespan. And I'm not going to tell you why, but he has a very personal reason for this. And this is what ultimately pushed him, after a career in law, followed by a career as an entrepreneur. He then decided that he was going to study and get into this science of longevity, and for very personal reasons. And what this has led him to is a place where he is now working in collaboration with Dr. Vladimir Khavinson from the St. Petersburg Institute of Gerontology. If you haven't heard this name yet, Dr. Khavinson is the guy who has brought us peptides as we know them today, particularly the bioregulators. And his story is fascinating. We talk about it a little bit in this episode. And then, so he's working with Dr. Khavinson. He is now a member. Dr. Bill Laurence is now a member of the St. Petersburg Institute. And he has been running a clinical trial with a group of people in the US for the last 3 years to establish whether or not using bioregulators in a personalized way can actually help to reverse or slow down the rate of aging. So you can't really reverse your age. I mean, you've been around the sun as many times as you've been around the sun, but at a cellular level, can we slow down and maybe reverse aging? And we talk about some of the results in this podcast, and I think you will find them fascinating. How are they measuring this? So they're measuring this through telomere length, and they're also measuring it through DNA methylation patterns using the Horvath clock. Now, in terms of the DNA methylation results, we couldn't get to them today because we were already at an hour and a half. So that's what part 2 is going to be about, which I'll release in maybe 3 weeks or so. The telomere results that he's able to share so far, we do talk about today. And we talk about the tests that he uses and the whole 9 yards. So without further ado, I'm going to let you guys dive into the episode. But first, of course, I have to say that all of the information in this podcast is for information purposes only. Please don't run out and decide you're just going to do this on your own, which is an interesting statement because the bioregulators are quite different than the peptides we're used to talking about. The bioregulators that he's using, the Khavinson bioregulators, are actually qualified as food supplements. So you'll learn more. If you guys are interested in, even though I'm going to repeat that this is for information purposes only, before you run out and decide to do any of this stuff, you've got to check with your health professional, your medical professional. You've got to check in with people because, you just never know how your body's going to respond to these therapies. Some of them are not approved. So please, please, please take this as in the spirit it's intended, as sharing information and educating yourself in your own personal journey. But if you decide that you want to give some of these peptides a try, then you can go, I will put in the show notes the link to a website where you can order these bioregulator peptides along with a discount code. And finally, my last little spiel is, of course, if you get value from this episode and from this podcast in general, please leave us a review. Please share it with your friends in your networks, because the bigger we get, the more of these amazing guests I can get on the show for you. And it is my joy doing this podcast. I got to tell you, I feel so grateful that I get to do this and talk to these people. It really is, of all the things I've done the last 10 years, aside from coaching people and watching them achieve amazing things in their results, doing this podcast is just amazing. So let me mention again how grateful I am for you guys. And if you would be willing to leave us a review and even to send me your comments, I would be so grateful again. If you're looking to connect with me, you can find me at natniddam.com. That's my website. And also you can connect with me through my Facebook group, which is the Biohacking Superhuman. Oops, no, I had to change the name. It's Optimizing Superhuman Performance Group on Facebook, on We, where we can speak more freely about more topics, because Facebook, as many of you probably know, has become a bit prickly on the alternative health spectrum. So you can go to We, to the Biohacking Superhuman Performance group. And there's nothing we can't talk about. It's a smaller group. I'm not there as much, but it's definitely there. And then finally on Instagram, it's just at Nathalie Niddam. Nathalie's got an H in it. Remember, Nathalie, and last name is Niddam. And I can also be found on Clubhouse. Every once in a while, I'll participate in rooms there. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you guys. I think there's a little mention of our episode sponsor before we get into the episode, but the sponsor is quite relevant to this discussion. Although it's not bioregulators, it's one of those nutrients that our body needs to renew itself at a cellular level. So without further ado, here we go to our sponsor, and next we get into the episode. Enjoy. Hey folks, just one thing before we get into the episode, and that is a word about our podcast sponsor this week, and that is Primeadine, made by Oxford HealthSpan, which is the brainchild of my good friend Leslie Kenny. Primeadine is an incredible source of spermidine. Spermidine is one of the most incredible supplements that I have come across in a long time. It addresses 6 of the 9 hallmarks of aging. And this particular spermidine product is incredible for a bunch of different reasons. One, it's super clean. There's nothing but spermidine and prebiotics that will support your body's own production of spermidine in the capsule. It is a high quality wheat germ extract. And what they've done to make sure that it doesn't go rancid and go bad is they've defatted it. They've removed all the fat, all those delicate omega-6 oils that can be good for you in certain contexts. But once they go rancid, and they go rancid very quickly, it's anything but good for you. So Primeadine addresses 6 of the 9 hallmarks of aging, folks. Everything from the proper folding of proteins to autophagy to cellular communication, the proper DNA protection. Did I say autophagy? Anyway, 6 different hallmarks. If you follow me on Instagram, you can go look for a couple of posts I've written about spermidine, and you will see why this is a supplement that I include in my stack every single day. And frankly, it is part of the foundation stack for every one of my clients. So if you decide you want to give Primeadine a try for yourself, you're going to want to go to primeadine.com and use promo code BIONAT15, and you will get 15% off your supplement. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is that not only is Primeadine doing all this incredible work under the hood to keep you healthy and rejuvenate your body and keep you youthful and vital, but on top of that, you're going to see it on the inside, because you're going to grow stronger nails, better skin, and thicker, better hair. It is actually quite the most amazing thing. I haven't seen too many supplements where I've gotten so much positive feedback from my clients and from my group followers. So by all means, if you haven't given this stuff a try yet, you must, but you will know that it will take a good month or 2 before you start to see the effects and the benefits. So if this resonates for you, give it a shot. You won't be sorry. And now enjoy the episode. Welcome to the show, Dr. Bill Lawrence. It is such a pleasure to meet you. Now, do I say your name Lawrence or Lawrence?
Either way is fine. You can even say, "Hey, guy."
Perfect. I'll remember that. So, Dr. Lawrence, you are involved in, probably in my mind anyway, just in terms of my fascination with things and the fact that I've been kind of buried in the world of peptides over the last couple of years, in probably one of the most fascinating clinical trials that has taken place in the area of, we can call it anti-aging, regenerative medicine, whatever the case may be, in this space of the Dr. Khavinson Bioregulator Peptides. And so I, first of all, want to welcome you to the show and thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today.
You're welcome.
And now I'll just keep going. I was ready to launch into the podcast all by myself. Okay, so having said all that, and we are going to get to all of that fascinating stuff shortly, but I really love to start the show helping people to understand a little bit about my guest. And you do not have, by any stretch of the imagination, you have not followed a conventional road to where you are today. So would you be willing to share with us a little bit of how are you here today doing this, and as much of your backstory as you're willing and comfortable sharing?
Yes, I am. I'm pleased to be here. I'm just pleased to be anywhere. And I say that based on the following. In the religion that I was raised in, they do a lot of genealogy work. In fact, they're famous for the genealogy work, and a lot of these databases, Ancestry.com and so forth, actually use the data that this church has accumulated. Well, I can say it's the Mormon Church. Okay. And so they have vast data banks in terms of genealogy work. And growing up, I knew somewhat what the family genealogy was, and what I realized later when I was an adult was that in the prior 200 years, where we had both birth and death data, no male had lived longer than 70 years, and only one male made it to 70. I'll mention him in a few moments. All the males died in their 50s and 60s, almost everybody that we had information on, certainly for the last 3 or 4 generations, from heart disease. And my uncles, my grandfathers all died in their 50s. My father had his first heart attack at 57, fatal heart attack at 65. And knowing that, of course, I was aware that I better do what I can. And part of that was, at this point in my life, I was sort of an entrepreneur, building medical buildings and shopping centers and all that kind of stuff. And I realized with my father's death, I realized that what's important to me, to earn another $1 million or $2 million or $5 million, or is it to have a longer life and a healthier life than my ancestors, including my father? So with his death, I sold off everything. It took me 5 years to sort of dismantle my little enterprise, and went back to school and got a master's first, and then got a PhD in nutritional science, actually. And started doing research, and this would be 30 years ago now. The one male that made it to 70, this is sort of a sidebar story. The one male that made it to 70 was this wonderful uncle of mine. He was a non-denominational preacher, and just the most humble, honest, ethical man I've ever run across. And he would preach all the time. There's a section in Psalms that basically says that human life should be 70 years. Well, that's 70 years. Right. He turned 70. 3 months later, he came down with a diagnosis of cancer, and about 4 months later died. So the lesson there's actually 2 lessons, I think. One is, be careful what we put into our brains.
Absolutely.
Yeah. he had spent his whole adult lifetime talking, preaching, and basically saying, that kind of thing, the palms. The second lesson is you should always consult your attorney on serious questions, because if he had asked his nephew, I'd have said, yeah, but there's this other section, I can't remember where it is now, that basically kind of says, it's the opposite of prisons, where you get time off for good behavior. Well, there's a section, I wish I could remember where it was, that says if you have good behavior, you can get another 10 years.
Oh my God. And he missed that part. So
well, if he had consulted me, I'd have done the research. I mean, I'm laughing, but it was kind of sad that, anyway. So my father's death was a pivotal moment because of the family history. And so that's what brought me into the field of health. And because I had the law degree, and as a sort of a tax attorney, I was used to doing a lot of research. It was just a natural to dig in and become sort of a research expert, you might say. And when I got my PhD, I spent the first 5 years doing research mostly for alternative medical clinics and alternative doctors to be able to decipher for them the real results from pharmaceutical clinical studies.
Nice.
rather than the published results. And you probably know the difference between relative and absolute.
Yeah.
All that. So I spent the first years doing that, basically explaining to the doctors what the reality of various drugs were, talking about and providing research with regard to the cholesterol myths and the statins and all that kind of stuff. And then my focus became longevity at that point.
Nice. Okay. And so longevity makes total sense with where you are today, but how did you get to exactly where you are today? So you got interested in longevity. At what point did you discover or uncover or, kind of part the curtains, if you will, on this whole area of study, which is the bioregulators, which is really like, this is full on out of Russia. This is Dr. Vladimir Khavinson's life's work, really.
Yes.
And it's not, the Russians have not gone out of their way to make this information available outside of Russia, certainly not to North Americans for any number of reasons. And so how did you get there? How did you find Dr. Khavinson's work? Because I stumbled upon it quite by accident. I would imagine in your world, being in the longevity space, there was a bit more intention behind it.
Yes, there was. I became aware that there was a difference between telomeres and telephone poles.
Okay, well, that's a good distinction to make.
Yes, and I narrowed it down a little after that.
Yeah.
That actually was the start. I came to understand, of course, that that telomeres have something to do with longevity and also health span and so forth. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions with regard to telomeres, and there are some scientists that will argue that it's not necessarily causative, it's association, all that kind of stuff. But my research indicated that was probably an appropriate intervention area, was telomeres. So I did a lot of research, and what was really helpful was Google Translator.
Yep. You got to love that thing.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Next to Google Scholar, it's magic.
Yeah, truly. And so I could now read studies, that were in Mandarin. I could read, Russian studies, et cetera, et cetera. And I ran across a study by Professor Khavinson, where the pineal gland peptide that they had developed under the auspices of the Soviet Union military, actually, they had data showing that it activated the telomerase enzyme and could lengthen telomeres. And when I realized that and did, a couple of years of more study and more research and so forth, I decided to go knock on their door.
Nice.
It helped that my family is from Russia. I'm an American with an American passport, but I have a father named Ivan. I have two brothers named Ivan. That's almost as good as a Russian passport for the Russians. Anyway, so what happened was I literally went knocking on their door. I went to St. Petersburg. I mean, I set up a meeting, and they were so impressed that an American, I don't know if I'd call myself a scientist at that point, a researcher, that an American researcher would be interested in anything that they were doing. Because as you alluded to, there has not been a lot of communication and sharing of information between Russia and America, which is unfortunate.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And Professor Khavinson was so surprised, I guess you would say, that an American would come all the way over there and ask them, what are they doing and where can you fit me in?
Nice.
And I think what actually got me in probably is my wife, Vess. She's incredibly, what I say, not attractive in the physical. She is that, but people just are attracted to her. She's just honest.
Great energy.
Yeah, great energy. That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Khavinson could have sent me out the door, but because I had Vess with me, it's funny how they
get with her. Okay,
yeah,
nice. Whatever it takes. Listen,
yeah,
who cares?
yeah, whatever works. But I mean, not in a
not in a bad way. I get you.
Yeah, right. But they were impressed the fact that the two of us came, and there was actually an instant liking between Khavinson and I. He's the brightest human being I've ever encountered. And the staff people were really gracious and so forth. And so I kept going back, and over a period of time, they assigned me some kind of a title. I've never been able to figure out how it translates. I think it maybe says something about assistant janitor or something like that.
I'm pretty confident it goes beyond janitor.
Well,
I'm just putting it out there. I don't know that they let the janitor run the studies.
Yeah. But let me give you just real quick a little history here. I'm sure you've read about it. These peptides were developed, like so many things, by the military, the Soviet Union military.
Yes.
Just like American military, in the NASA program, you have, I call these spin-offs, okay, where they have all of these things that it wasn't really on the agenda, but they discover things along the way that are really helpful, commercially valuable, and so forth and so forth. Well, what happened was the Soviet military, particularly the submarine corps, was having real problems because they were sending out young seamen in their 20s and young officers in their 30s for 3-4 months at a time, sitting in a submarine that was probably built in the late 50s and 60s, because this is all happening in the 70s, sitting next to a nuclear reactor with some very crude protection. And they were finding that when these submarine patrols would come back, that the personnel were having all sorts of medical issues, particularly immune problems and so forth. Today, we would call it accelerated immune syndrome or something of that nature, but basically thymus issues.
Sure.
And
not to mention that their circadian cycles must have been a mess.
Oh, a mess, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how the military today in the U.S. handles that kind of stuff. Obviously, there's got to be a whole program for that. Anyway, so the Soviet Union military, because it was the Cold War and everything, and there was also some concern by the Soviet military that the U.S. was developing some lasers that would damage hearing and eyesight and so forth. And so they threw huge amounts of money, according to Professor Khavinson, at trying to figure out what they could do to rehabilitate, the submarine people. They also had what they call the cosmonaut or astronaut cosmonaut program was starting up. They were concerned about what would happen when these cosmonauts would come back from space. So they threw, according to Professor Khavinson, so much money. It was like an unlimited budget. He says you could never do today what they were able to do at that time because of the Cold War. And what they did is, as you well know, scientists don't just sort of wake up one morning with, the bright idea and the new invention. Okay, you build on the on the shoulders of everybody else. Einstein might be an exception to that. But anyway, so what they did was they went back and looked at the work that Ivan Pavlov had done back in the early 1900s. Ivan Pavlov is known primarily for the classical conditioning with animals and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, his real field, of course, was human digestion, the physiology of human digestion. Yeah. Well, they worked on the dogs, but what he was really doing was trying to learn basically all about human physiology and the digestive processes and so forth. So he had done an awful lot of work. He was very active until his old age. So they went back and got a hold of his data. And he had even talked about peptides at that point, because peptides are simply small proteins. They're chains of less than 50 amino acids, and the Russian ones I'll talk about in a moment are even smaller than that.
Mm-hmm.
But they were able to work, or they were able to start working in this military context using peptide theory that Pavlov had developed at that point. So the Russian program of peptides goes back. Pavlov received the Nobel Prize in 1904.
Right.
So their program goes back a long ways.
Didn't he do a thing with gastric juice?
Yes, absolutely.
And a lot of people believe that BPC 157 was the active peptide that he was actually tapping into at that point.
Yeah. He was 150 years ahead of time. Well, 120 years ahead of time. So,
no kidding.
Anyway, so the Russians, Khavinson, and a group of the scientists, they were in their mid-20s, late 20s at this point. They built on that, and they produced the first two peptides, which is the pineal gland peptide called Epitalon, and the thymus peptide. And that goes under a variety of names. In the clinical study, we use the capsule forms of these, and it's called Baldonics for the thymus, and the pineal is Indoluden. Anyway, they started developing these, and they found out very quickly that they were an incredible intervention in restoring health and regeneration at the cellular tissue level. And they started running some long-term studies. Maybe I'll bring some PowerPoint into this at this point.
Yeah. And so people, I know you can't see this unless I break down and post this on YouTube, which I may, as long as Dr. Laurence is okay with it. But if not, I will put up the PowerPoint, the slide. I'll put the slides into the show notes for sure.
Yes, I'm going to have to skip through a whole bunch to begin with. It'll be click, click, click. I may comment on a few of these. Okay, let's bring this up here. Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
So guys, just so you know, we're looking at a couple of slides here titled Peptide Longevity Protocol. I'm sure that none of you would be interested in this stuff at all. And
no, the overall program, we call it the Peptide Longevity Protocol, or the Peptide Longevity Program, sort of interchangeably. It's the umbrella for the two clinical studies. One clinical study is a telomere study, or a telomerase activation study. That's the study that's been underway for formally about 4 years now, probably another year and a half before that, when I was grabbing anyone that had a pulse and testing them and so forth.
Well, I so wish I would have met you then. Yeah.
And then the other study is more recent. It started about 2 years ago. It's a DNA methylation study using Dr. Stephen Horvath's epigenetic clock out of UCLA. UCLA is also where I went to law school, so I was real pleased that Horvath was associated with UCLA, because it gave me some contacts. Anyway, those are the two studies.
So they're separate studies. You're looking, on the one hand, you're looking at the telomeres for one group, and the other group you're looking at the methylation. And so are you not tempted to look at both for both sides? Or?
No, we are.
You are. Okay.
The enrollment in both is required.
Okay. Okay.
And I'll mention it in a moment. I'm not going to go through all this peptide definition and so forth, and amino acids, because you know all that, and I think your people probably know it. The peptides are simply very small chains of amino acids. The definition generally accepted in science is if it's less than 50 amino acids, it's a peptide. And if it's more than 50, it's a protein. But the Russians, though, figured out that the smaller number of amino acids, the more effective. It's one of those things where less is more.
Yeah.
And so their peptides are 2 and 3, and a very few of them are 4 amino acids, and no more than that.
Yeah. And my understanding is that, and that's why my understanding from listening and reading some of Professor Khavinson's material is that those 2, 3, and 4 teensy little peptides are so small that they actually are orally bioavailable, that they will not get further broken down in the gut and can therefore be absorbed into the system, where they will essentially find their way to the receptors that are ready to receive them.
That sounds just like Professor Khavinson himself defining it.
I don't think
and
so, but anyway.
Yeah, and so they easily pass through the cellular membranes. They actually pass through the blood-brain membranes. So this just shows the binding. This happens to be a pancreas peptide binding to the DNA.
Yeah. And maybe this is something we can talk about as you're flipping through these, is how do these peptides actually work? And, when we talk about receptors, we're talking about receptors that activate genes. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so in terms of method of action, what these peptides are actually doing is upregulating or downregulating gene expression.
Yes. They're in some ways, they're similar. Here in America, we have for thyroid, we have the natural, I guess they call them drugs now because they're pharmaceutical required here, but Armour is the old traditional.
Right, desiccated thyroid.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. That is sourced from pigs.
Right.
And it's the same principle in that these peptides come from basically about 12-month-old calves, very carefully raised. The organs are then harvested, very, very carefully filtered and processed and so forth, and then made up into the amino acid complex. And like the Armour, the peptides are organ specific. So when Professor Khavinson's team takes, for instance, tissue from, say, the pancreas of a 12-month-old calf, or from the heart, or from the retina, and go through all the processing and so forth, which is a hellacious processing, because Khavinson's explained it to me. I mean, it's just hellacious what they go through. Anyway, when they end up with the final amino acid chain, or what we call the bond, and you swallow that, or you inject it, or you take it sublingually, then it goes to the particular organ that it was sourced from, just like the Armour does. And so if you take a heart peptide, it ends up with the heart. Brain peptide goes to the brain, etc. Somewhat like a salmon. I used to live in Alaska for a while, so somewhat like a salmon, going back to. But what's interesting about this is there are, of course, many, many peptides. The Russians have what we call the natural peptide, or the cytomaxes. Those are the ones that are sourced from the 12-month-old calves. And those are the ones we use in the clinical study. In Russia, they are considered to be food supplements because of the source. Mm-hmm. And that's why we can bring them into the United States without too much difficulty. Once in a while, a shipment will get snagged by customs, and then I have to jump through some hoops and so forth. But on the whole, they are able to pass through because they're food supplements, which they are.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt, but so when the peptides are extracted from the glands or the organs, is it just the peptides, or do you believe that these, especially these, I'm sorry, somebody's trying to hone in here, especially these, the glandular ones, do you believe like the Armour, there are cofactors and other compounds that remain with the peptide, or yes, are they really truly just purifying the peptide?
I've asked Professor Khavinson that, and in his explanation, he speaks fluent English, but there are words in Russian that don't translate so well. Basically, the impression I have from him is that you also end up with the cofactors.
Okay, so that would explain in many ways Well, I mean, and it's interesting because another thing that I've learned is that, or heard, is that these natural source, if you will, peptides that are extracts from the glands and organs might take a little longer to exert their effect, but
Yes.
might be longer lasting in their effect. Whereas the synthetic analog of that specific peptide sequence, which can be recreated in a lab, if you will, might be faster acting, but won't last as long. And that might speak to almost like that nourishing quality of the cofactors that we kind of can't explain.
Yes.
Fairy dust.
Yeah, you have an excellent understanding of it. There's a clinic in the St. Petersburg Institute is basically a research facility, but they also have a clinic there. Then outside of St. Petersburg, they have the manufacturing facilities and so forth, where they process the organs and so forth. In the clinic, they treat Russians without a charge, and other people from other countries will come to the clinic for various treatments, particularly retina issues, because the Russians are very advanced with retinal science.
Yep.
And the normal protocol there is to start a patient at the clinic. They come in, and it's a day kind of clinic. They come in during the day. They'll start them on the injectable intermuscular peptides. And there are intermuscular peptides pretty much for most of the 21 of what we call the natural or cytomaxes. And then at the end of 10 days or so of injections, and they'll do multiple injections. Peptides, the Russian peptides, are never used singly. That is, you don't just use one peptide. There's always a complex of 3 or 4. In the clinical studies, we even use more than that. Anyway, so it starts off with intermuscular, and then they'll send the patient home, typically with the synthetics, for a short period of time. And a short period of time might be a few weeks, maybe a month or so. 2 months would be a very long time. And then they also send them home eventually with the natural peptides. The synthetics are quicker acting, as you understand, because they are basically one amino acid, one molecule. As a result, it quickly passes through everything, gets into the cells and the tissue and so forth. And they only use those typically if never for maintenance. If a person has some kind of a significant health issue, they will go with the synthetics first, always followed then by the natural peptides. What's interesting here in this chart, I know that people can't see it, the recent vaccine in Russia is a peptide vaccine.
Not surprising.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not surprising at all. Yeah.
I have my views on the peptides and so forth, but if someone held a gun to my head and they said, you've got to take a vaccine for COVID, and if I couldn't squirm out of it any other way, I would say, okay, give me the Russian peptide vaccine.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Okay, let's move on. Okay. This is just, of course, that's Khavinson in the group there in front of the St. Petersburg. This is Professor Khavinson. He's a retired colonel in the military, extremely well known in Russia and actually in Europe. This slide shows that he's the president of the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics for the Europe, for the European region.
Just so you know, people who aren't seeing this, I'm seeing like a full page listing of Professor Khavinson's chief of gerontology, vice president of Gerontological Society, like the whole right through Europe. So
yeah, he's well known in Europe, unknown here in the United States. Though he has over 700 scientific publications, clinical studies, and so forth. He has numerous patents because all of these peptides are patented.
Yeah.
Okay. The Russians didn't work in secret. I mean, they did originally under the Soviet Union, of course, because everything was secret in the military. But they have partnered with a variety of research centers, including the National Institute on Aging here in the U.S., for a lot of these studies that I'm going to talk about in a few moments, with institutes in Italy, Germany, France, Spain, Belgium, and so forth. So it's not like these peptides have been kept a secret. It's just that the interest among scientists and the medical world in America hasn't reached out that far, and unfortunately doesn't at the moment seem to be willing to make that reach as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because when I've talked about these with doctors who I've spoken to or interviewed on the podcast, they are gobsmacked and desperate for more information. So, it's interesting how this information hasn't managed to filter its way to, if you will, the front lines, because the front lines are all over this stuff when they hear about it.
Yeah, it's the internet that's sort of opened that door.
Yeah.
I put this is a slide of Professor Khavinson about 2 years ago receiving Russia's highest civilian award. It's called the Freedom Award for his 40 plus years of service to the Russian people. And Khavinson, of course, is my boss. He supervises the clinical studies. And what I laughingly say is that his boss is pictured next to him, and that's President Putin.
Yep.
Giving Khavinson the award. What Khavinson is saying in this little clip here is that he believes that in the next 10 to 15 years, that peptide pharmaceuticals will become the most crucial development in the world. And that's already starting to happen, certainly in Europe, because these peptides, they have no side effects, unlike pharmaceutical drugs, and they're so much more powerful than pharmaceutical drugs. I've never seen, of course, President Putin at the clinic, but his personal physician is in there every single month, carrying out boxes and boxes of the peptides. And Putin, he's very keen on being healthy and so forth. And his doctor has mentioned in interviews that President Putin is biologically younger than his chronological age. Okay, so let's see. Traditional aging patterns, people get old and so forth. And this is a reference to your earlier question. As you know, Nathalie, there's all sorts of theories on why we age and so forth. I mean, there's more than what's shown on this slide. And on this slide, I probably have 8 or 10 of them. But you'll notice at the top, the telomere shortening and the DNA damage. Those are the two that the clinical studies focus on. And I'll talk about it later, when Dr. Horvath at UCLA and his team of scientists, there were about 65 of them working on this for years, when they came up with the Horvath epigenetic clock, that meant that we had a way of measuring, in a sense, biological age. And so Professor Khavinson and I, we knew that telomere shortening was, an easy target for us, because they had already shown 30 years ago and published in 2003 that the bioregulators would lengthen telomeres, but there wasn't any data on the DNA damage, but now we could test, and that's what the second study is.
Right. And it's interesting, because I think that by addressing DNA damage, you would think that you would address some of those other markers of aging as a downstream effect, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So this happens to be just a picture of Ivan Pavlov, brilliant man. This is Khavinson when he was in the military. I mentioned earlier about.
He does not look like he's aged one bit. How does he look in real person?
Let's go back to this. A little old. In fact, I have that picture just 2 years ago with President Putin. Yeah, he's very healthy. He's my age. He'll be 70. Yeah, he'll be 75 this year. I'll be 75 this year.
Yeah. Now you don't look your age either. So you guys are doing something right.
Well, thank you.
You're still around, as you said. So you're already beating the records from your genealogical tree, right?
Yeah, they actually use these peptides with as I mentioned, the cosmonaut program. They used it. I put this in for that conference. This is Misha. I know that people can't see it, but Misha's got her little space helmet. She was up in space, and that's her little cute space helmet and space suit and so forth. Because both the U.S. and Russia, of course, started the space programs with animals.
Right. So Misha's a dog, guys, a very, very cute little dog. Well, so I'll be sure to include this slide in the show
Yeah,
notes.
yeah. I mean, the
Misha
little
got a
space
stamp
helmet is
too.
precious. Oh, yeah. This is Chernobyl.
Yeah.
The Russians used the peptides for the cancer victims fairly successfully. It depended, of course, on how far progressed the cancer was, but the Russians used these peptides to intervene with the cancer victims that came out of Chernobyl. What people don't remember, and it's kind of off the point a little bit, is that originally they had taken robots, crude as they were, from Germany and Japan,
Yeah.
and attempted to introduce those to start a cleanup, or at least actually the initial inspections. And the radiation was so bad it destroyed the robots.
Mm-hmm.
So they used altogether about 600 military personnel.
Yeah.
You know, and this is just a picture of many of those. As you can see here, the protection equipment they had, it was so crude, basically just jackets.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And they use the peptides for lots of these people. I put this in for the conference. In Russia, they have a very different way of treating failure. Let's put it that way. These are three men who were the directors of the Chernobyl facility. And unlike America, where they have these golden parachutes, that companies have negotiated, and even if the company's failing and not making any money, the CEO can leave with millions and millions of dollars. Well, it doesn't work that way in Russia.
No.
These men were sentenced to Siberia for long, long periods of time for their role in allowing Chernobyl to happen. They use them with the Olympic teams over in Russia, particularly the gymnastic teams, these peptides. They use them for recovery primarily while they're training and so forth, because as you can imagine, the people, particularly in gymnastics and so forth, have a huge impact on their bodies and so forth. And the peptides, particularly the muscle peptides and so forth, are used to regenerate.
Right? Muscle, bone, and
Yes,
stem cell as well.
all of that.
Now, but I also read somewhere that he talked about, and maybe this was an interview you did with Phil Mickens, where you talk about how when they looked at the telomeres of these 20-year-old gymnasts, they were horrified to see that they had telomere lengths that were more compatible with a 40-year-old person. And so that's part of how they used, I would imagine they used the Epitalon or Epitalon peptide along with others to help and they were able to restore telomere length over a period of time.
Yes, actually, that's correct. And we're going to actually look at some of that data in a few minutes. But
sorry.
No. And I'll explain what drives that. Actually, I'll explain it now.
Okay.
What the Russians understood and the Americans finally understood, Elizabeth Blackburn, who one of the three co-recipients with Carol Greider and the fellow at Harvard, received the Nobel Prize for their work in telomere science in 2009, because they had worked for many, many years and had identified the enzyme, that what we call the telomerase enzyme, in pond scum, actually tetrachyma, I think, as I recall the name.
Yep.
They had discovered it in pond scum and received the Nobel in 2009. She went on to do a lot of research, and what they discovered was that more than anything else, more than lifestyle, more than diet, anything else, what drives telomere loss is stress.
No kidding.
Yeah. And people throw that word around, stress is harmful, stress is going to kill you and so on. Actually, with regard to telomeres, it is, because what Elizabeth Blackburn did with her associates, they did a number of studies of people, including pregnant women. And this is fascinating. What they did was with questionnaires and interviews and so forth, they interviewed women with respect to how they felt about being pregnant. That is, was this a wanted child or an unwanted, unexpected child? What was going on in that woman's life during that 9-month cycle? Was there a good marriage? Were there problems in the relationship with the spouse? Was there a loss of a loved one during that period of time, like a parent or someone? Were there economic problems? Were there emotional problems and so forth? And when all the data finally settled out, it was clear from the data, published data, that the women who had a difficult pregnancy gave birth to offspring or newborns who had shorter than average telomeres.
Unbelievable. Yeah. It's how this whole maternal, and it's really the environment of the fetus, right? That will impact its ability to develop and how it develops. That is pretty fascinating. It's sobering.
Yes, right? Very.
It's sobering stuff.
So what the Russians did was they did some long-term studies. This one was published in 2002. This, I think, was a 15-year study and a 6-year study, depending on the age brackets. I'll show it to you in a summary here.
Yeah.
So what they did was in the 90s, actually started in the late 80s. In this particular study, let's see. Yeah, they had two categories. They had what they call elderly people, 60 to 74 years old, and they used over a period of 12 years. If I put this laser on, can you?
That's okay. Don't worry about it.
Okay. If you look in the middle of it there where it says mortality rate in the course of 12 years.
Yeah.
Okay. In the control group, which means that those not using peptide, just what they call polyvitamins, in other words, just vitamins, normal diet, et cetera, et cetera. In the course of that 12 years for that age group of 60 to 74, 44% of those people died, which would be about normal, except that in Russia, and this was conducted both in Russia and Ukraine, they have less longevity than they do here in the US and so forth, although the US is catching up, or maybe I should say catching down to them.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Well, they live much more stressful lives typically.
Yes, yes. So 44% of the people not on the peptides, but using peptides over the course of 12 years, just using the pineal gland peptide, just one peptide, it dropped it in half to 22.3%.
Yeah, that is astounding.
Yeah, it dropped the mortality rate by 50%, just using one single peptide.
And this is all-cause mortality, right?
Yes, yes.
Which speaks to me to this central role that the pineal gland plays in health and aging. And it's not just aging, it's this whole idea of this circadian clock, this master clock that will then, from a upstream or downstream, however you want to call it, perspective, affect just about every other aspect of our ability to stay healthy.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's drop down to the bottom of this, Natalie, where it says old people. The Russians are not the most diplomatic.
I love the nomenclature.
Yeah.
Elderly is 60 to 74, and once you're 75 and up, you're just old.
Old, yeah. That's the Russians for you. They're very blunt at times.
They're direct. We'll call it direct.
Yeah. I happen to love that about them.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in the old people category, 75 to 89, the study was for 6 years, obviously because of the age. And during that 6 years, 81.8% of the non-peptide group died, again, normal for that part of the world. Using one peptide, again, the pineal gland peptide, it was 45.8, basically 46%. But when they added a second peptide, and this is the thymus peptide, it dropped the mortality rate to 33.3%.
Amazing.
So you had a reduction from almost 82% during that 6 years down to 33% with two peptides.
Yeah, that's pretty astounding.
Yep.
And still staying with our old people, moving on to the next slide.
Yeah, I'm going to get, now let's talk about morbidity here for a moment. This was a study that was done with Gazprom. Gazprom is the Russia's sort of equivalent to BP and Standard Oil and so forth. They do a lot of gas and oil and gas work all over the world.
Yep.
They did a clinical study with 11,000 employees. They gave them 6 different peptides: the immune system, the brain, the blood vessels, the lung, respiratory, the liver, and cartilage. And then the control group was 3,000 of the employees who did not receive the peptides. And this went on for a year. So as you see in the chart, the sort of the purple block, the control group, had what you see there is, significant amount of morbidity or sickness. We don't know the exact number because it's in the clinical study. The point here is that the groups using the peptides reduced in respiratory diseases, which is very relevant because of COVID, dropped it 2.7 times. In other words, 2.7 times less morbidity using those peptides for these employees. And when they looked at total morbidity, not just respiratory, it dropped it 2.3 times. I mean, a huge decrease in morbidity. And this is these employees, Gazprom, as you can imagine, very rigorous kind of employment.
A tough job. So one question for you though. So the observation period was 1 year. Mm-hmm. Were they given one course of, does it say in the study if they were given one course of the bioregulators, or because usually bioregulators, we talk about 2 courses 6 months apart. But
well, that would be for maintenance. Okay.
Yeah. For maintenance. That's not even for illness, but yeah.
So I'd have to go back and look. As I recall, this was every other month, I think, but don't hold me to that.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's a fairly rigorous intervention from a bioregulator perspective.
Yes, and with the clinical studies, it's every month actually.
Okay.
I'll get to that if we have time. So
we're going to make time.
Okay, so no pun intended, but we can really see the results with retinal issues. Yeah. And the Russians are known pretty much throughout the world, I'm not sure about America, as leaders in vision issues, retinal issues, and so forth. So what this is, these are eye scans, field of vision scans, and what they're showing here is that with diabetic retinoplasty, on the left, what you're seeing is green means that this person has vision. Red, yellow, black means impaired or no vision, the black being no vision at all. So after a couple of years of treatment, and I can't tell you the frequency at this point with it, most of what we see here after a couple of years of treatment is green.
Wow. Yeah.
I would estimate a 90% reduction in the black and the red and the yellow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one on the left looks like a patchwork, and the one on the right is almost all green with a color.
Yeah, this person has a life at this point in terms of their vision. Here's retinitis pigmentosa. Lots on the left, lots of black. You treat for a couple of years, and a lot of green replaces the black. With retinitis pigmentosa, you lose the central vision. You lose the peripheral vision. Yeah. And people who have it talk to me, and they tell me it's like looking through a straw.
Yep. Now I have a good friend. I have a good friend who has this, and has spoken to the institute in St. Petersburg about it.
Wonderful. Yeah. I've got a couple of teenage boys that have been on the peptides for 6 years now. 2 brothers, 13 and 15, were diagnosed in the same year. It's an inheritable disease, unfortunately. Yeah. They were diagnosed within the same year, both of them with RP. Yeah. And through a series of people just knowing each other and so forth, they ended up coming to me. The parents and the boys came to me. I got with their doctor, and we put them on a peptide program. I just talked to them 2 weeks ago, and their night vision improved, their peripheral vision improved, and they still have a diagnosis of RP. I'm not sure that it's ever completely curable, but they have normal lives, whereas over 5 years, it's a progressive deterioration disease.
Yeah, I mean, guys, just know that RP, retinitis pigmentosa, is considered by conventional standards untreatable, progressive, like it's going to do what it's going to do. So I guess, do you know, and has any information come out from the Khavinson Institute, from the Institute in St. Petersburg? Do people need to be continually treated with the peptides to keep the RP at bay? Or is it something that over a period of time you reclaim your vision and you're able to stop the peptides? Do we know that? Or is that one of those things that people are still figuring out?
We're still figuring it out. Okay. where I lean at the moment, based on what I know, is that you're going to have to stay on a maintenance program.
Yeah.
The maintenance program, I liken it to this, and that is, you can't go to the gym every day for a year,
Right.
and get really strong, and then, I'll go every 6 months after that. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. So let's skip through these. Here's the same thing with macular degeneration. A significant improvement. I would say there's probably a 75% reduction in the black and the red and the yellow. Here's glaucoma. Same thing. Vast improvement. I won't go through this cancer thing in any detail. This is an induced cancer trial where they were attempting to induce cancer in mice and rats and so forth, either with the DMPA, which is a chemical complex that they use, or with X-ray or constant lighting and so forth. If you look, Natalie, over here at the far right-hand side where it says control and peptide,
yep.
What they're showing there, we'll take the first one up here with the rats with the Epitalon. The control group came down, 81% of the control group ended up having cancer induced, in other words, diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah.
The group taking peptides before and while the trial was going on reduced it to 26%, as I think that's crazy. What it shows.
Yeah.
And all the way down the line, you'll see, if you look at the control group, peptide group, you see these dramatic reductions in successfully inducing the cancer in the control group compared to the peptide group.
It is amazing to me also the constant lighting, and people, we've been talking about light and the influence of light and the importance of the right light at the right time. But here, again, if you don't end up going to these slides, there's a slide here that shows that Epitalon was administered to female rats and male rats who were held under constant lighting. So it never got dark. They never got the melatonin. Their circadian rhythm got completely disrupted. And in the female rats, 41% ended up with tumors in the mammary glands,
Yep.
versus 20. That's the control group versus only like almost half, 27% with the peptide. So the peptide, again, not a magic bullet, but really significant impact here. And in the males, the constant lighting might produce leukemia. And what we see here, 12% of the males developed leukemia versus 0, like none of them in the peptide group. That's pretty crazy numbers right there.
This slide was in the conference because we used a huge amount, the doctors in the clinical studies used a huge amount of the natural respiratory lung peptide. It's called Taxarest. I couldn't get it in as quickly as I had it in. It was gone in terms of all the physicians were using it for themselves, for patients and so forth. So that's enough, I think, all I want to say about that. So here we go with the telomeres. Okay.
And sorry, so for that, would you not stack that as well with Visugen, with the blood vessel one?
Oh, yes. We never just use one peptide.
Right. Yeah. So you could probably almost imagine a stack that might be like the thymus peptide, the lungs, and blood vessels or something.
Yes, those would be the three primary ones. The Ventfort for the arterial system, the Taxarest, the Volonix for the immune system, and we almost always throw in the pineal gland, the endolutin as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about telomeres.
No, people can look those up.
Good. They're basically the end caps on our chromosomes, and they're necessary in order to allow chromosomal integrity, to keep basically everything functioning as it should. The problem with it is that every time there's a cell replication, you lose a little bit of that end cap, and people who go to the internet, they'll often be told that they're somewhat similar to the little plastic ends on our shoelaces, like I think they call them aglets in English.
Yeah.
And you can lace up that shoelace for a long time, but when that little plastic end tip starts to become frayed and so forth, then it's difficult and finally impossible to continue and that would be sort of the situation with cell senescence. As long as that end cap is of a certain length, then the cells can replicate rapidly and 100% functionally. That is, can represent. I'm stumbling around with words now. Can replicate flawlessly. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go through this. We have some American scientists. Bill Andrews is probably one of the leading people who talk about telomere science and so forth. He's just simply saying here that when our telomeres get a little shorter, our cells age and so forth.
I think what's interesting also is the idea that you have telomeres in organs that are organ specific. And
yes.
You can have your telomeres in your heart be like, I guess this might explain heart disease. Your telomeres don't uniformly shorten through your whole body all at once. It's going to be organ specific based on, or system specific based on what you've got going.
Yes. And so when the labs that do the testing, and I have used probably 6 different labs in the past years and have settled on one. We use SpectraCell Labs out of Houston, but I've used everybody else, including LifeLink out of Madrid and various others. And what they basically give you is average telomere length. So,
okay, so they look at the whole system.
Yeah, because they're looking at lymphocytes and in the white blood cells and so forth, and so you end up with just sort of an average. They cannot, as far as I know, I'm not aware if the science has advanced to the point where they can actually go look at your lymphocytes in a particular organ. I don't think that they can.
You'd almost think they'd need a biopsy or.
Yes, exactly, which the patient would not be so pleased with. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, people can read about telomeres and so forth. This is Elizabeth Blackburn. She basically is making the statement people with longer telomeres have less risk of developing the common illnesses of aging. So it isn't just about longevity, it's also about health span. In other words, minimizing disease exposure, vulnerability. So this is actually the study that I mentioned to you, Nathalie, that I saw that was translated. It was in 2003 or something like that, where they was showing that Epitalon induces telomerase activity and telomere elongation. And when I saw it in a translated thing, that's what took me to Russia.
Yeah, I'll bet. Got you right on the plane.
Yep. This is Michael Fossel, really a really good fellow, MD, PhD, has written the finest lay professional book called The Telomerase Revolution. Recommend it highly to everybody. You can read it in probably 4 hours. A person who without a science background will readily understand it. He talks a lot about the science of it, but then what's interesting is he goes into the various major organs like the brain, the heart, and so forth, and talks about how it affects, how telomeres affect all of that. He's working on putting together a synthetic that he has in FDA stage 1 trials at the moment. He's hopeful to finally get a synthetic because he wants a patent and get the insurance companies and then to pay for it, and hopefully it will be effective for people. He and I correspond periodically. He knows what the Russians have. He knows what I'm doing with the clinical studies. We're using the natural peptides that can't be patented, and so there's no big monetary value, unlike the synthetics.
Right. So I have a question for you on the telomerase. But so we know that I recently heard something about cancer cells having very, 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 very long telomeres.
Yes.
So if we're somehow positively affecting telomerase so that our telomeres don't shorten or might even lengthen, how does this not negatively affect cancer cells? Do we know that, or is this still a bit of a question mark? Because everything we're seeing here is that, Epitalon, thymolin, these peptides would be a hindrance to cancer cells.
Yes, if a person has diagnosed cancer, we would not want to be lengthening their telomeres, even though there are some studies that indicate that lengthening telomeres is not going to contribute to that, because the cancer itself is going to create its own telomerase enzyme.
Okay.
But just out of a sense of caution, we screen out anyone that has had a cancer diagnosis for the clinical study. But Khavinson tells me, and other published research indicates, that lengthening people's telomeres is not going to trigger cancer. But if a person has cancer, what we don't know is, will it contribute to that situation? The answer probably is no, because the cancer itself is activating the telomerase enzyme.
If anything, it might help you win the race. But anyway, let's carry on.
Okay, so we know from a lot of studies that short telomeres play a central role in almost all the age-related diseases. Now, I'm not saying by that short telomeres cause those diseases, but what we do know from lots and lots of clinical studies, and there's probably at least, I think last time I looked, there's more than 5,000 PubMed and other published articles on telomeres, okay? What we do know is that the people who have shorter telomeres become more vulnerable to these various diseases. And so the idea is, if you can keep your telomeres from significantly shortening, or what we call accelerated telomere loss, the belief is that, and backed up by a lot of clinical studies, is that you are less vulnerable to all of these diseases. And the science basically shows in the published studies that people with short telomeres come down with all these common diseases more readily. I think this slide is, we know from the published studies that their short telomeres are associated with the cancer, heart disease, diabetes. The fraternal twins that you see here at the bottom, this is one of those where I was talking about, that the twin who had the shortest telomeres had a 300% greater risk of death than the twin that had the longer telomeres.
Interesting.
Okay, so here's the clinical study that we call the telomerase activation protocol. Sometimes when I'm explaining, I put this in when we were still admitting lay people into the study. Telomeres are sort of like tread on the tires.
Yeah.
You journey a long time. You go on drive your vehicle and so forth, and the running components can be fine, the engine can be fine, but as you wear down the tire, you're not going to be able to go on a longer journey at that point. And so what we're doing is basically creating a new tire.
Yep.
Okay.
Nice, deep, beautiful treads.
Okay, so our clinical study was based on, we factor in chronological age, then we get people tested for their telomeres, again with the SpectraCell, and they give us what we call a telomere age. They also give us the percentile compared to their same age peers. And so we established these baselines for people. This is now old by probably 2 years. I just haven't taken the time to really update the slides. But initially we had 37 subjects who had completed at least 2 years in the clinical study using a variety, using most of the 21 natural peptides. And the ones shown here are cartilage, liver, pancreas, pineal gland, the thymus, the sirtuin, and the Ventford for the arterial system. But we use all of them basically. Spreadsheet that we had for all these people, where we show a baseline over on the left. Those columns are their chronological age at baseline, their telomere baseline age, and the percentage and so forth. The middle is then after 2 years period of time, the improvement in basically everybody. And I know the print's very small. I'm going to show it to you in some separate documents here.
Although some less so than others, and
much so, huge
have to do
variability.
Yeah. So does that have to do? Have you figured out, like, is that their lifestyle, diet, or you don't know?
No, I sort of know after doing this for all these years. It's based on a couple things. There is some correlation. We have 3 dosage levels, and we let the participants decide which dosage level they want to be on. So we have a very low dosage, we have a medium dosage, and we have a high dosage. And so the people who have chosen the low dosage kind of, I'll say, and that's not a very scientific measurement, but
Yeah.
kind of there's a correlation with low dosage, but sometimes not. Okay. What I have discovered, backed up by Elizabeth Blackburn's research and so forth, is more than anything else, it's because I know all these people. I'll explain that in a moment. It's the stress that they're under.
Yeah. Yeah.
More than anything else.
Bet. Yeah, for sure. Well, because I'm seeing here that the people who've not had the best outcome. I mean, there's some here that are jaw-droppingly unbelievable. Like anyway, there's a couple that have seen incredible changes, but there's a few people that have seen very little change by comparison. So one of them's low, but there's another one here who's apparently on a higher, like this one from 74 telomere age to 68, which is still pretty good, but nothing compared to the guy or the person that went from 76 to 45. And the 74 to 68 is on a high dose versus the 76 to 45, which is on a medium dose. So it must have to do in part with lifestyle and maybe even their own genetics, right? Like their own
it's the whole package of things, but I think I would put at the head of that list stress.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if it impacts a newborn.
That's no kidding.
Yeah, at conception, we measure telomeres, what we call kilo base pairs. It's a measurement of length, basically, and we actually do it with PCR. PCR is very effective and very, reasonably accurate as these things can go. For the polymerase chain testing is very accurate for telomere. It's a wonderful research tool. It's a total failure as for the virus, for the COVID and so forth. Okay, so here's just a bar chart reflecting what you were just observing, with that some people got a lot of telomere lengthening and others got very little.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's look at the data. Now, here's the raw data. This is me. I was the first one. You got to experiment. Good scientists experiments on their self first.
Absolutely.
Then you grab your loved one secondly. So this is, let's see, I was 66 at the time. Holy smokes, that's 9 years ago when I did my first telomere test. This is what I was saying earlier, that I was getting interested in telomeres as a biomarker. Mm-hmm. So at age 66, this baseline test reflected that I have the telomere age of a 72-year-old, and I was in the 47th percentile compared to my peers. This is very typical what I see for Americans. Again, I think it carries a lot over in terms of the stress situation. Most Americans will come in 4, 5, 6 years older telomere-wise than their chronological age. Huh. So this is before peptides, okay? This is before I met with the Russians and so forth. Yep. And became the assistant janitor. So 2 years later, another telomere test, again, before peptides. I'm now 68, so I've aged 2 years chronologically, but I've picked up an extra year, so I'm now 75 telomere-wise. Actually, 2 years, I think.
3.
3 years, yeah. See, my telomere loss was accelerating. I was having, literally, based on telomeres, an accelerated aging situation. Okay, so then... October of 2015 is when I started using the peptides specifically for telomere intervention. So we're coming up 6 years, my goodness. I was 70 at that point, and my telomere age had been reduced down to 68. So prior to that, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This test was in June of 16. I'd been on the peptides since October of 15. So about 8 or 9 months I had been on these peptides. And at this point, at age 70, my telomeres had been reduced down to, lengthened to that of a 68-year-old. So I picked up
in the right direction. Yeah,
I picked up 7 telomere years, you might say, at that point.
Absolutely.
2 years later, and
look at you.
Yeah, I'm 72 at that point. My telomere age is down to 44. And we see this, the longer a person's on the program, it seems to accelerate. And then...
Is there a bottom, do you think?
Well, I have one person that came in the other day. She's, I think, 60 something. Her telomeres are equivalent to a 7-year-old.
You're kidding.
No,
How does she? Okay, now how does she feel? I mean, I want to know how she looks, and I'm sure she looks great. But how does she feel? Like you know what I mean? Like people in their 60s often will complain about aches and pains and creaky energy, sleep, this, that. How does? Is it showing up in how she feels? Do you think?
I'll say yes, but let me qualify that.
Okay.
As you would know, a subjective evaluation is very different than a lab test. Okay,
Mhm.
and so I talk to these people all the time. There's now almost 100 people in the 2 clinical studies, and I talk to them pretty frequently, mostly by email, actually, and so forth. There is no person that I have spoken to that feels worse than when they started.
Okay.
And many of them have, and I have to be careful here, but many of them have experienced organ regeneration that is reflected by positive labs. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to ask that. Like, have you seen that people's health conditions have improved? And as much as you can say that is what you're saying right now.
Yes. And
labs seem to be improving.
Yes. And it's not that I end up seeing the labs of the doctors. They send me their labs all the time. And I see the improvement for where they have issues at the beginning, and then a year or 2, 3 years later, I see significant improvement in lab markers. So
Wow.
this is the
And
last
look at
one.
You.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm 75 in a few months. I feel like I'm 30. I'm a ballroom dancer. My partner's a competition ballroom dancer. I still take lessons. We dance 3 nights a week, both Argentine tango as well as ballroom.
Love it.
I think most people who see us, and I'm going to show you Vess's numbers in a minute, they must think we're probably in our 50s, probably Vess 35.
Yeah.
And I have to take the lessons because if I don't maintain my skills, I think Vess is going to run off with an Argentine tango instructor or something. I'll show you a picture. Yeah, I'll show you a picture of it in a moment. Anyway, so this is my last one. I test it myself every 2 years. At age 73, my telomeres are equivalent to a 35-year-old.
Amazing.
And I went from the 47th percentile in the beginning to 88% on this last test.
Beautiful.
Now let's take a look at Vess, and I'm going to show you a picture of Vess. Vess is with a V. This is her baseline back. She was 60. She's going to be 65 next month. So she was 60 when we did her baseline. She also had accelerated telomere loss. Her telomere age was 63. She was in the 49th percentile at that point. This was June of 2016. I'll skip the interim because we tested her every year and just get to the last one. Wow, she needs to be retested. We're overdue. Anyway, her chronological age was 62. Her telomere age was 33.
Unbelievable.
At this point. Yeah. And this is Vess. I know people can't see the picture.
Geez.
Yeah, she looks.
This slide is going into the show notes. Wait till you see this.
Yeah. Yeah, she probably could pass for 40 or 45 at this point. She'll be 65.
Wow. So 18 months. So, okay. So next question. And I think I know the answer to this. A younger person most likely responds faster to the therapy than an older person. Because like we see here, 18 months, she was able to reclaim 25 years on her telomere age. Whereas with you, who was in your late 60s, 70s, it took a little longer to kind of back up the bus.
That would seem to be the case. That would seem to be a reasonable hypothesis. The problem is I don't have enough data with young people.
Right.
At this point, let me think. Tora is the youngest person we've ever enrolled and tested.
So yeah, because we don't have the data, let's say, for that young gymnastics team from the Russians, but so we don't know how long it took them to get them back to that 20-year-old state from their 40-year-old state after, let's say, the Olympics.
That's correct.
Okay. Interesting.
So
fascinating. I love it.
Yeah, this is another oh yeah, this is LL. I'll explain this in a minute. Her baseline, she was 69. Her telomere test came in at 80. We put her on a program. A year later,
Wow.
her telomeres were that of a 63-year-old.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Now, and this is just one of many, as you saw from the bar chart and so forth. There's a lesson, or I guess a lesson you could say. At the beginning of this 4 or 5 years ago, if I knew someone and they had a pulse, I wanted them in the program because that was the only requirement.
Well, because you have to find people who are willing to buy into this at that time, right?
Well,
I'm sure they were looking at you like you had 3 heads.
Well, exactly, because here's the pitch, okay? I've got these pills that were developed by the Soviet military.
Made from cow parts.
Right. And they come from cows. And I'd really be pleased if you could swallow these for the next few years, and we'll see what happens. Yeah. I mean, that's the definition of trust. Okay.
Absolutely. Although I can tell you, of the people listening to this podcast right now, there's a whole whack of them looking your number up, going, where do I sign up?
Well, I don't want them to find me. We'll have to talk about that.
I know. We talked about this. We're not giving links. I promise.
Okay. So the lesson here, though, is that this lady is my ex-wife.
Well, look at what a nice guy you are.
Yeah, we were dating in high school, got married young, and so forth. We divorced in 1980. The friendliest divorce in the world. We had our arms around each other, crying at the time.
Aww.
We just knew that we shouldn't be husband and wife. We've been friends ever since. I mean, literally, every couple of weeks I talk to her. So the lesson here is for the benefit of 2 human beings that once had a relationship, for the benefit of children, because we have 2 children, and they have been really the beneficiaries of us having a nice friendship.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah.
And the other advantage is that if you can maintain that kind of a relationship as a scientist, you can experiment on them.
Okay. That's a good benefit. I mean,
yes.
And look at she reclaimed, what was it? Like 17 years?
Yeah, well, about 17 years. Yeah, and she's still in the program.
Oh, she's probably like 22 by now. I mean,
I think
she's come out on top here.
Oh, yes, yeah. Anyway, back to the whole clinical study. So for the people who'd been in it 2 years, and this information is a little dated now, but it's running about 6 years on average, 6 years. Telomere reduction, or a telomere age reduction for every year in the program. And so for the first 2-year period where people had been in the program for 2 years or more, it was a 12.32. When you took all those people, the 37
on
people,
average.
Yeah. So 12.32, and just we can skip that. I just thought that was cute. We want to be the guy with the long telomeres.
Yeah. No, we've got telomere humor here.
Yes. Yeah. Now, this is Vess sitting in Dr. Khavinson's conference room. The pictures that you see in the background are famous Russians and other people, including prime ministers from different countries who have come to the Institute for treatment. Professor Khavinson is looking like the proud father at this point.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very pleased with this. Was once we got into the 2-year mark. So
that's amazing.
Okay, that's that. Okay, so that's current aging expectations. This is what Professor Khavinson and I believe is going to be and is.
Yeah. And that slide, people, just instead of watching people stoop over, we now finish with a standing tall, nice physique person stepping out. So where do you suppose this is all going, though, with, if we believe that human lifespan has an endpoint at around 120 years, do you think, and again, like this is all, we don't know, conjecture, we're kind of learning as you go along here. Oh, you're talking about that right here. Practical immortality. Okay, I'm going to stop with my question and let you go on. Sorry.
Well, your question is a perfect introduction to this.
Yeah. How long can we live, and how long can we live well? Figure.
That's the key, of course, is the latter. Longevity by itself is not important. The goal is to have longevity and health span. So what this slide shows, this is from a really smart scientist. I know him just sort of briefly, not again. What he is saying, and a lot of us know this already, is that we're just on the cusp at this point between various peptides, not just the Russian peptides, but other peptides, other discoveries, where it looks like we're going to be able to, if not cure, we're going to be able to control a number of chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth, even though it's, diabetes is exploding, but that's all about lifestyle and diet and so forth.
Yep.
All of these things, the idea is that over the next 10 years, if you can stay healthy to take advantage of what's available now, which it takes a certain amount of discipline and so forth. You got to have the right diet. You got to go to the gym and work out. You got to reduce the stress. You got to do a number of things.
Meditate.
But if you can stay, if you can stay healthy for the next 10 years, and 10 years is a guess, there will be such, I think, phenomenal is the word I would use, medical and health interventions that we then can leverage that up to 120 or 130 years. Wow. And that's what the concept of the bridge is. But you've got to stay healthy to cross the bridge to take advantage of those things.
Amazing. And then you're saying in the future, we may be seeing lifespans of, let's say, for our grandkids, let's say, they may be looking at the possibility of 150 to 200 year lifespans. Boy, that people better like their careers.
Yes.
Or really good at it.
or just change every 10
years. Well, do like what you did, right? Have multiple careers.
Yeah. So I know we're used a lot of time. There is a second study. Maybe we can do the second study review at some later date because we've used up a lot of time.
Yeah, no, I think if you're willing to do a part 2, I'm all over that. I think that would be amazing. We can talk. This is the epigenetic methylation study. So maybe what we'll do is we'll kind of wrap it up here because I don't want to take up too much of your time either. And besides, people at this point have run out. They've probably finished a notebook and moving on to the next one. So
yes.
Or run out of ink on their pen. So I will just ask you, if you don't mind, maybe 1 or 2 short questions to finish off. And then what we'll do is we'll figure out a time to go into the next study. And that would be, you've already answered for me, I think, what you think is the most important thing that people can be doing to improve or maintain their health. And I think stress management, lifestyle, frankly, like what you talked about, almost trumps even the peptide's ability to lengthen telomeres. Somebody who's living an extremely stressful life. Would you say that is, what would you say? Is it stress? Is it diet?
Are you asking basically to create the longevity that we're seeking? Yeah. What is the formula? Is that sort of what you're saying?
More or less. Like, what do you think is the most important? Or we don't even have to say one thing. What would you say are the top 3 things? If you were to say to someone, look, here are 3 things I think that everybody should be doing right now to improve, to make it to that bridge, right? To make it to that 10-year mark, healthy enough that you're able to cross the bridge to 120.
Okay. Diet is in my world is number 1. You can't have the standard American diet that they call SAD and expect to have longevity or health. It just isn't going to happen. The food production industry basically has destroyed what I would consider to be actual food.
Yep.
And so diet is number 1 because I don't know this scientifically, Nathalie, but I would think as powerful as these peptides are, I think without a proper diet, you're not going to get nearly the benefit, but maybe I just don't know. But anyway, diet is number 1. You've already identified number 2. You need to get the stress out of our lives.
Yeah.
Number 3, I would say, and the order could change. you got to keep moving. You got to have exercise. You have to have some kind of a hobby or whatever that keeps you moving all the time. And part of that is flexibility. One of the biggest problems I see with aging people is they become frail and they lose the flexibility. And then that interferes with their lifestyle. They start watching TV instead of going out playing tennis and so forth. You also have to, and you may want to edit this out, but you have to avoid, at least in America, going to a conventional physician.
Yeah.
You've got to go to the alternative, holistic, integrative. They all need to agree on a term at this point for the non-conventional doctors, because the conventional doctors are not serving their patients well, for a lot of reasons. You also have to, if you're going to reduce the stress, you have to, in my world, avoid the media, because the media is not accurate anymore. When I was a kid and Walter Cronkite, would explain the news and stuff, you could sort of understand it was probably reasonably accurate, although the Vietnam War changed that. But you can't listen to the mass media anymore.
Yeah,
they're not reporting.
Frankly.
Yeah. And if you want the stress out of your life, you're going to have to turn those people out and just ignore them. You also have to ignore, we've seen this last year, you've got to ignore any, quote, scientist who is with the government, with the pharmaceutical industry, a university that gets funding from the pharmaceutical industry. You have to ignore anything that comes out of that place. I won't go further into it than that. And I say the last thing is, you have to be grateful.
Yeah.
Just grateful that we woke up this morning, grateful that I'm breathing and talking to you there in Canada and so forth. Grateful that you're going to do whatever you're going to do this evening, or whatever. Just to have this life is so amazing, particularly at 75, to have this life and to have the possibility for me of I'm counting on at least another 25 years.
So. Which you've already beaten all the records in your genealogy. So
yep, I have been fortunate in that sense.
Crushing it.
Yeah, so that's what I would say are those things come to mind.
I love it. Thank you. So. Okay, last one. What's the one thing that surprised you the most in doing these clinical trials? If you had to name one, what's the one biggest surprise for you?
Wow. Yeah, here it is. It's not a positive, unfortunately. The biggest surprise is I would have people referred to me. This doesn't happen pretty much since I restricted it to health professionals. I would have people referred to me, and if it was a married couple, one of them would be really gung-ho in terms of their health, and oftentimes the other had no interest in cleaning up their life, and would even sometimes sort of sabotage.
Yeah, I see.
Honey, it's just one drink. It's just, one more donut, whatever it may be. So I would say the biggest surprise, and that may be because my life for the last 30, 40 years has been so focused on being healthy and not dying, basically young.
Yes.
That I guess the biggest surprise, I kind of thought everybody would want to be like me in terms of I want to wake up tomorrow morning. That's probably the biggest surprise, is that there are numbers of people who they're not here's an example, and I know we need to finish this up. This is so sad. I had a couple that were in the program years ago. Wonderful Philippine couple living in Las Vegas, and the husband was diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's, just after we had started the program. There were some signs there and so forth. But we kept him on the peptides and so forth with the idea that maybe, with his permission of his doctor and so forth. And I had to meet with the doctor and explain what we were doing. The one thing that was troublesome was that this fellow grew up drinking Pepsis. We're sitting there at his table in their home one evening, and I'm just talking to him about, we're not making any progress with the dementia. In fact, it's getting worse. And I, as I have said to you several times, if you want to get well, you're going to have to give up the Pepsis. This is heartbreaking. You're going to have to give up those Pepsis. And he looks at me, and his wife is sitting there, and he says, I've drank Pepsi. He was like in his 60s. I've drank Pepsis ever since I was a little kid in the Philippines, and I just can't give them up. And I said to him, your dementia is getting to the point where you may not know who this lovely woman is sitting across from you, your wife of 40 some odd years. You're going to have to choose between the Pepsis and having an ongoing relationship with this lovely woman. So what's your choice? Honest to God, Nathalie, what he said is, I'm not going to give up the Pepsis.
Yeah, it is heartbreaking.
Yep.
I've actually sadly seen that myself in my practice, and it's gobsmacking. It's astounding when you meet someone like that. And those people are out there, and you can only do what you can do, right?
Yep, exactly.
People have to want it more than somebody once said to me, if you're working harder than your clients, then there's something wrong.
that is so true. So true. It's taken me a long time to actually learn that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have to just, release them with grace and wish them well on their journey.
Yes, exactly.
We all have our path.
Yeah.
And on that, Dr. Bill Laurence, I am going to thank you again profusely for your generosity of time and knowledge and information. This has been an absolute pleasure. And I really look forward to part 2, where we can talk about the next study.
It's my pleasure too. It's been lots of fun.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.